I absolutely know this to be true. The doctors who work for the insurance companies, if they deny payment to a hospital and the hospital says, wait a minute, that's not right. And they do something called a peer-to-peer. So they have the doctor call the doctor of the insurance company. If the denial stays, the hospital doesn't get paid, that doctor gets a bonus.
The doctor who did the denial.
So for the doctors that work for insurance companies,
There's incentive
to deny. And of course, the insurance company has incentive to deny because that boosts their profit.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Dr. Mimi Benjamin, who has worked as a physician for over 30 years, the last 14 in Juneau. She is the former medical director and creator of the Bartlett Regional Hospital Hospitalist program, which started in 2017. She is the 2018 recipient of the Golden Stethoscope Award from the Alaska State Hospital and Nursing Home Association for her relentless advocacy for patient safety, for serving as the physician champion for the electronic medical record, and for co-founding and serving as medical director of Bartlett's antibiotic stewardship program. This interview was actually recorded in May of this past year. During the legislative session, I rented an apartment from Mimi and her husband, Brian, who is also a physician. Somehow, in my move back to Anchorage, I thought I'd lost this audio, but I found it, and I'm happy to release it now. I believe Dr. Benjamin offers an interesting perspective from her experience in Southeast Alaska. Dr. Mimi Benjamin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Petaluma, California, but then we moved to Rochester, New York for middle school and high school. And then I went to college for theater arts at Brandeis University.
Oh, that's why you love Broadway.
Yeah, I graduated in theater. I didn't have any sciences at all. And then went to New York and performed in musicals and on off-Broadway for 5 years.
So you're like a musical theater performer?
Yeah.
I did not know that. No, I just thought you really liked musicals.
Oh.
I guess for listeners, you're my landlord. So we've had some conversations.
Friend.
Landlord and friend here in Juneau. And we've had some conversations about Broadway shows. And...
Yep. I did the national tour of Fiddler on the Roof.
Wow.
Yeah. And then...
Were you chorus or did you understand?
I was one of the little girls. I was Schrinson. And so that was when I changed careers because the lady that was playing Golda, I was just not digging going from town to town and doing the same thing over and over again. So she was a nurse and talked me into going into medicine. So that's what I did. I went to Columbia.
To do your prereqs? To
do my prereqs. And then I went to University of Rochester.
That's unusual.
Yeah.
You went to Columbia to do your prereqs. Mm-hmm. How did that happen?
In those days, there were a lot of people about my age, I guess I was late 20s, who were deciding that they wanted to go into medicine. So Columbia had a post-baccalaureate pre-med 2-year tract where you just went straight through. All you did was science, and then you did a year of research while you were applying to med school. It was a big class.
And you weren't the oldest student?
No. And actually, med schools in those days really liked older students because we stuck with it more than people going straight through. So it was pretty easy to get in after that. University of Rochester and then Duke Family Practice Residency. And then did outpatient practice for both Duke and UNC at various times. At the same time, I worked in quality. I worked for the state QIO, is what they called them at the time, the Quality Improvement Organization. Since they've gotten rid of the state organizations, and now there's a couple big ones that do the whole company. But I worked for them, worked for the quality department at UNC, and then in 2010, left it all behind and came to Alaska.
Why'd you come to Alaska?
Really burned out from university medicine. Down in North Carolina, a typical clinic day was 30 patients, and you were there many hours trying to get through 30 patients a day.
And then charting.
And just wanted to start over doing clinical medicine only, not doing any administrative stuff like I was doing. And we looked at what states were best rated for medicine. And I
Because
think,
your husband's also a doctor.
yes, he is. And he was also feeling the same
Burnout.
And so I think Alaska was number 4 at that time. And there were a lot of really good things about working in Alaska. And we wanted to be on the water and we wanted to live in a boat.
And you'll have a child, but was she already graduated or she was?
She was graduated high school and she was already in college in Charleston.
Basically, you were free. You could
we were free to go. Yeah. Yes. We looked at Anchorage and Sitka and chose Juneau to work for Search, which is where we landed in the beginning. And
for folks who don't know, what is Search?
Southeast Alaska Regional Healthcare Consortium, which is the Native-run organization, at that time involved clinic work and hospital work at Bartlett Regional Hospital. Went back to OB, hadn't done OB in years, so they retrained me in OB and broad spectrum family practice. And did that for about 3 years, 4 years, and then went into private practice in town and worked as a private doctor at the hospital. And then in 2016, formed a hospitalist service at Bartlett Regional Hospital. We didn't have a hospitalist service at that point, and they were interested in having one, which is a group of doctors who just take care of hospitalized patients and are on-site 12-hour shifts so that there's always a doctor in the house. Prior to the hospital service, the only doctor in the house was the ER doctor at night, typically. So it was much better for the nurses to have a doctor available.
So just to explain for our listeners, I think folks who lived in bigger cities, it's really common to have doctors who just work in the hospital and take care of hospitalized patients. But in the olden days and in smaller cities, your family practice doctor, if their patient was admitted to the hospital, then that's your patient. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And there are still models. When we moved here, that was the model.
So basically, whoever your primary care doctor was in town, if you got put in the hospital, they would need to go see you in the hospital.
Yes. And they would care for you in the hospital. If they weren't there, then the same practice would take care of you, their partner or whatever. And that was pretty much how things went. The only problem with that model at that time was that there were a lot of patients who didn't have a doctor. In those days, what they did was they would just split those patients up among all of the primary care doctors, which worked pretty well.
And some of them, I guess, would pick them up and that would become their patient.
Yeah, when I did that, I would pick them up and they would become my patient, unless they were a tourist or something, and then they would go home. Yeah.
But with especially this time of year, tons of tourists in town.
Yeah, there were a lot of unassigned patients.
It makes sense to have a hospitalist service that just takes care of hospitalized patients.
Yes. And with the formation of the hospitalist service, Search, the Native organization, decided to give up their inpatient care and let the hospitalists manage their patients. And another practice in town did the same thing. And so we actually had a fair number of patients, enough to sustain us in terms of having enough patients to see.
So this is a philosophical question, but there are plenty of primary care doctors working in big cities that have never taken care of their patients when they've been hospitalized. And that would be outside their comfort zone. Do you think that there's a benefit to having the primary care doctor in the community do hospital work?
I think it depends on the doctor. So there are a lot of small towns that still have the model where their doctor is also their inpatient doctor. And the benefit to that is that they know the patient very well because they've cared for them, hopefully, over a long period of time. And I was one of those doctors in North Carolina. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't care for my patient in the hospital. But I didn't really feel like that was a problem. And they got really good care wherever they went. And then I would follow them up after they left the hospital. So I didn't really have a strong feeling one way or the other. I did see the advantage when I was caring for patients and coming to the hospital. The disadvantage is that if I had a patient in the hospital, I also had to go back to my clinic. Mm-hmm. So if something happened to that patient, I had to run back to the hospital instead of having somebody right at the bedside. So in the hospitalist model, and actually interestingly, in this small of a town, as a hospitalist, you get to know a lot of the patients anyway, and you already know their history. You've admitted them before, and it's a longitudinal relationship. So I think that there's benefits to both, and I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. I do think that people who are hospitalists get a little more comfortable with any scenario that could happen in a hospital because that's all they do. So they become an expert at some things like procedures and ultrasound and those types of things. Whereas the primary care doctor has to be really broad and, a master of all trades, so to speak.
Well, for better or worse, when I worked in Santa Cruz, the last ER that I worked in, the model there was that if a primary care in town sent their patient to the ER, they needed to call and give report. I've learned in Anchorage, that's not necessarily the model. I've called ERs and they're like, why are you calling? We're the ER. Of course, we're going to take care of your patient. I was like, I don't know. I thought you want to know something about them.
Yeah.
Different model. But there were quote unquote problem patients that primary care doctors sent to the ER because their clinic was full that day. Or there was definitely times where we're like, why is this patient here? We don't know. And I think that it's very responsible for the primary care doctors to take care of the patient at every stage of their illness all the way through admission to the hospital. That I think in other bigger cities, that responsibility doesn't have to be there. They can just send you to the...
Yep. Or even an urgent care can just send you to the ER.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think around here, it's pretty standard for the doctor who's seeing the patient in the outpatient setting to call the doctor in the ER. And sometimes they even call the hospitalist if they think the patient is going to be admitted and they just want to give all the information they can. But also in the age of electronic health records, it has become a lot easier because now if you think about it, let's say you're Dr. X in the clinic and your partner's on vacation and you have to admit your partner's patient. You don't know that much about it, but you just go and look at their chart. With the EHR, the hospitalist can do the same thing. So
they can read the last note.
They read the last note. And there's high variability in the clinic notes that you get. And I say that EHR, that it's nice that you can see those records, but I'll also say that there's a lot of garbage that goes into the electronic health record. They're not particularly well designed for what they're supposed to do, depending on the one that you're looking at.
Right. And I'll say some doctors do a very good job of writing very relevant information that's helpful. Some use templates that import tons of information that makes it look like it's a big note, but it's not useful. Importing tons of irrelevant labs can fill up a lot of the note, but I don't know if they're there for a sprained ankle. Who cares what their last labs were?
Yeah. It's true. And also there's a lot of listing of problems that never goes away. A sprained ankle might stay with you for
2011.
Yeah. So there's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that you have access to something, even if it's the most important thing, which is the medication list. Typically we'll have access to it. And the state, like every other state, is trying to get everybody onto an exchange so that if you can't get the record directly from the practice, you can get it on this healthcare exchange if they're part of that.
Which I think was part of Obamacare, or goal of Obamacare was to have some sort of universal EHR that you could have records shared easily. That sounded like something that would happen and hasn't really happened.
Yeah, because of the variable EHRs that are out on the market. So they don't speak to each other well, and they all have a different way of communicating with the exchange. It's hard to understand the notes sometimes. And the other thing I've noticed, I'm currently doing some work for the Department of Disability. So I see a lot of notes, and I see the ones that come out of the exchange, and then I see the ones that come directly. And what happens is you also get a lot of repetition. So you can have the same note over and over again, and you have to figure that out. Oh, is this a new note? Oh, I already read that.
So having worked at Search, having done private practice in Juneau, having started the hospitalist group, what do you see are the biggest challenges of healthcare in Southeast Alaska?
So there was definitely a change after COVID. When we first got here, we rejoiced in what seemed like medicine from the 1950s. It seemed like everybody had a doctor and would see the patient through everything, their OB care, their hospitalizations and things like that. It felt very much like we were behind the times, but in a good way, because things back...
It was holistic.
It was holistic.
People knew patients.
People knew patients, and that's how it was back in the 50s and the lower 48, right? Everybody knew their patients, and they all had a doctor. When my dad practiced, there weren't even insurance.
Your dad was a doctor? Was he a family practice? Well?
He was one of the first family practice doctors there was. He was one of the original that formed the program at University of Rochester. He was a GP, so he had 1 year of internship, and then they invited him to come and be a professor at Rochester and help form the field of family medicine. So that was cool.
I mean, you didn't follow in his footsteps because you did musical theater.
Right, I did.
Were you rebelling against the family practice?
No, half of the people in my family were in the arts and half were in medicine. So it was just a natural thing.
Gotcha.
But he was very influential in my choosing family practice because I watched how he had his practice over the years. And when he was a doc in California, some patients would bring him eggs or chickens. I mean, he saw everybody regardless of whether they could pay. There were no insurance companies. And everything was less expensive because there were no insurance companies. The first wave of change really was when insurance companies came to be and HMOs.
That's so interesting because from my perspective, I've never lived in a time when there wasn't insurance. So when your dad was practicing, in the beginning, it was cash pay, and if they didn't have cash, they did eggs or chickens.
Or the painting in your apartment.
Oh, really?
A gift. Yeah, he's a famous painter, McChesney, who had some issues that my dad was caring for him for, and he was very poor because his art hadn't started to sell, so he gave him that painting and some other things. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Now, obviously, medicine is extremely expensive.
Yeah. And I really feel like a big piece of it, I think everyone feels like a big piece of it, is the insurance companies because they're all extremely profitable. And they make it very hard for patients and for doctors to get paid. And you start to have to put more and more resources into that. Prior authorizations, as you all know, things that the doctor spends hours a day not seeing patients, but doing paperwork.
Right. Firsthand. So when I graduated from PA school, my first job was in a primary care clinic where they were still using paper charts. So I saw how poorly some folks charted in paper charts, but I also saw how incredibly fast. They may not have been the best chart, but the person spent 2 minutes on it.
Yep. That was how we saw 30 patients a day because we had paper charts.
Right.
You could do a upper respiratory tract.
Yeah, and you would just circle things
and then write
URI.
But at the same time, they were very easy to read. And as long as you kept something at the front of that chart that had the medication list and the problem list, and you kept that up to date, anybody could go and look at a paper chart and have a beautiful picture of the patient. That is not true with electronic health records.
And then with the advent of electronic medical records, there was just no way that you could write URI. You had to write a history. You had to say 37-year-old female presents with cough. You had to start typing things. And I guess for listeners who aren't aware of it, doing a chart in 15 minutes is pretty fast.
Yeah, totally. We would dictate.
Yeah.
That would help.
But you have to go back to proofread because there's always mistakes, and some of the mistakes can be like saying the opposite of what you mean. Could be problematic.
But in the paper chart days, you would dictate and someone would type it up for you.
That's true.
And so there wasn't a lot of error. You still had to read it and make sure, but it wasn't like dragon dictation. It was much more accurate. So, I mean, I think that really changed things. When I first got here, I thought the search had a great system. I could get my patients what they needed. I could see 10 to 15 patients a day. That was a busy day. And it felt really like I had a lot of breathing room.
And it was half the patient load that you were having in
half the patient load. I had a lot of help, had a lot of specialty care right in the same system. That's still the case for search. They have
It's
a lot
easy to refer to specialists.
easily to refer to specialists. And as time has gone on, they've even gotten more savvy and they can do referrals online and they can get their patients what they need. Sometimes they have to travel, but I thought it was great. And then on the hospital side, I feel like Bartlett has always just been a very high quality hospital. And I've seen a lot of hospitals around the country. Patients will say the same thing when they come from down south. And that's still the case. When the patients come from down south and they come in Bartlett, they don't want to go anywhere else.
What makes Bartlett so good?
The amount of attention that people get, the nursing, the number of patients that each nurse has to have.
And do you think that's just a function of the fact that this is a smaller city? And
Yeah, it's a smaller hospital. They are staffed properly and patients get really good care. They have private room. They have good food. They have just a lot of services. They have great PT, physical therapy, occupational therapy. They just really find that they're well cared for. And they've been in other hospitals, and it's not always the case. And a big part of what's going on everywhere, really, Bartlett is suffering from it too, but they're trying to be very careful not to cut bedside services. They're really trying. But all the hospitals after COVID have taken these huge financial hits. And
can you explain why
Yeah.
hospitals have had financial hit after COVID?
yes, it was a good idea gone bad. So when COVID came along and the hospitals were all spiraling out of control a bit, the government gave a whole bunch of money, COVID dollars, to hospitals. But you had to spend those COVID dollars. And here, we didn't have a huge team to analyze, although really nowhere else in the country did either. This is something new. No one knew what was going to happen. But our hospital bought like 20 ventilators or something. We don't have the oxygen supply in Juneau to run 20 ventilators. So we were just spending these dollars trying to figure out the best way to do that.
Because
right?
like spend it or lose it. So
Spend it or lose it. And the other thing they did was hire a bunch more staff. Every hospital hired a bunch more staff. Now COVID is over. The dollars go away. You've got too many contracts, too much staff. And now all of a sudden you go into the red. And that has gone on every year, getting worse and worse.
it sounds like you had this amount of staff. You hired more because COVID happened. You kept the staff on and now you're in the red. It just seems like you would just go back to what you had before and then everything would go back to the way it was before.
Maybe, but it built both on the clinical and the administrative side. So it's a lot harder, honestly, to get rid of administrative people who have maybe developed new programs. They have worked really hard at Bartlett to look at all the contracting and all of the IT programs that they bought and things like that to try and cut that down too. But it's difficult. They built a crisis stabilization center. That's the other thing. There was a lot of grant money.
So they built things for COVID and now they have these things.
The crisis stabilization wasn't built for COVID, but yeah, they built a whole COVID wing, which has now been taken down. But it's just, they got used to spending the money and the money went away.
Gotcha.
And yes, you would think, oh, we'll just go back to what you had before. But it's really hard to go back to what you had before. And everything's more expensive too. Everything is more expensive.
So can you talk a little bit about that, about why things are so much more expensive than when your dad was practicing? Like how insurance has made things cost more? And simultaneously, why it's harder for doctors to get paid?
It's hard to wrap your head around. Although many people who aren't in medicine as patients probably have experienced with bills, trying to get bills paid, trying to understand why the bill didn't get paid.
Or a very common thing, thinking that you've gotten your bill and that you paid it, and then another bill comes for
Another
another
bill
service
comes.
that you weren't expecting.
Yeah. Let's just say there's a lot of steps. Step one, a patient comes to the hospital, gets admitted. There are two different statuses. They can go in as an admission, they can go in as an observation. If the doctor happens to choose a status that the insurance company doesn't agree with, they say, oh yeah, no, we're not going to pay.
And so then the patient is responsible.
Not always. If the hospital has a contract, say with one of the insurance companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield or with Aetna, no, the patient doesn't pay. The hospital eats.
So the hospital has to eat it.
So what happens? You say, okay, we disagree, or we'll rebill it, or whatever. That takes a couple staff people, right? It's not like that's free. That's someone's time. And there's a whole department at Bartlett that just works on that kind of stuff.
On fixing clerical errors to make sure that people get paid.
To make sure that the hospital gets paid. If maybe the doctor should have written something better, then they got to go to the doctor and say, hey, you wrote this. Maybe the doctor
gave a general diagnosis, but a specific diagnosis would have gotten paid.
Or there's conflict. Say a colonoscopy, right? A colonoscopy can be screening. Oh, let's see what's going on in there. Or you're 50. Or it can be diagnostic because the person has something bleeding or something. And if you are writing the note and it says screening colonoscopy, but then it mentions a little bit of bleeding, now it should have been diagnostic. So that goes to the company, says, no, that's wrong. And they go back to the doctor. You know what I mean? So all of that back and forth needs to delay.
The colonoscopy itself, the procedure will be the same. Right.
But the way it would get coded differently. So now you have nurse case managers who, are one group who are looking over the charts, trying to make sure everything was captured and make sure everything is right. Then you have coders who look at the coding, make sure the coding's correct. Have we given every diagnosis that the patient had the right code? And then it goes off to the insurance company, and then maybe the insurance company will pay it, but maybe they'll say, we don't agree with this, and then you have to go back and change things. And sometimes you have to go to appeals and things like that. Now, I will tell you this, because I absolutely know this to be true. The doctors who work for the insurance companies, if they deny payment to a hospital, and the hospital says, wait a minute, that's not right, and they do something called a peer-to-peer, so they have the doctor call the doctor of the insurance company. If the denial stays, the hospital doesn't get paid, that doctor gets a bonus.
The doctor who did the denial.
So for the doctors that work for insurance companies,
there's incentive to
deny. And of course, the insurance company has incentive to deny because that boosts their profit.
This is another perspective. So I worked for a physician group when I worked in the ER in California. And we had staff meeting once a month. And I won't say the names of the physician group or the name of the hospital, but I'm sure they're not the only one. They would post all the providers who worked in the ER and how much they billed that month so that you could see yourself compared. And I remember there was an older doctor, the nicest man. Really, if my kid fell and I took him to the ER, I would want that doctor to be, because that doctor would spend a lot of time with him. That doctor would explain things. He was pleasant to be around. He always billed the least. He was shamed every month. And he quit.
Yeah.
He quit because he was only seeing 11 or 12 patients per shift. Other people were saying, we were told to see 20. And so he was seeing less patients. He was probably coding correctly. We were encouraged to, we were told if somebody uttered the word pain, order a Tylenol, because then you provided a treatment.
So you can see why the insurance companies, it's not just their fault.
Right, because you've got these physician groups who are like, this is how we get
this is
maximum
how we're gonna get more money. It's, $20 for a Tylenol. Yeah, there's a lot of upcharging and stuff. So it's like this battle. And, neither side is right. I mean, we should be back to the 1950s where you went to the doctor and, you paid your bill. And there's a few hospitals that do cash only in this country. They're a lot less expensive. Same with overseas. There are hospitals you can go to and get the exact same surgery for much less. And their quality, like I think it's Thailand, their quality is really good. So it doesn't have to cost that much, but it's these layers just built up the cost over time.
Which something that came up this session was the direct primary care clinics where basically it is a cash pay. It's like a subscription service. Instead of having insurance, you pay a certain amount to the clinic, and that enables you to be seen at that clinic. They specifically say over and over again, this is not insurance. But when you look at it, it's an alternative to insurance. Your insurance is not going to be billed for those visits.
The visits, no, but if you do labs or those types of things, then it depends on the model. I think sometimes you do pay a little bit, but you pay a bunch up front. And then if you get lab, they provide you with stuff to go to your insurance company and get it covered, but they don't do that work for you. Or if you need an x-ray or whatever. Yeah. And that came into being when I was at a young, just out of residency. I was seeing that start because one of the doctors in my clinic went to that model. And the nice thing for the doctors is it's back to that having a lot of time.
Right. And not having to fight with insurance companies.
Right.
Not having to figure out which insurance this patient has versus this patient. What can I do? What can I not do?
Yeah.
Although it sounds like there's still going to be some of that inevitably.
I think it doesn't go away. But the nice thing is that also that you have direct access all the time. That's a benefit to the patient. If you're sick or having an emergency, you can call your doctor and somebody will talk to you as opposed to having to necessarily go to the ER or whatever. That's most of the concierge practices are like that. And you have someone who knows you longitudinally. And for the doctor, you don't have as much burden. And you can just spend your time seeing the patient.
Alaska is notorious for having the highest price of healthcare in the country. Can you talk a little bit about why?
I think everything's expensive in Alaska. That's number one. So getting supplies, it's all more expensive. I think that the insurance companies, everyone thinks they're denying us more than they're denying everybody else, but we're billing them the most, right? They would rather have someone go down to Seattle and get the service for half price. A lot of patients also go down to Seattle and get their services for less. It's expensive to live here. Food is more, so everything's more expensive. Housing, everything.
But is it double?
Is it double? That's a good question. I don't know.
See, you feel that just based on shipping things up justifies the increased cost of healthcare in Alaska?
No, I think it's multifactorial. No, I don't think you can totally justify the increased cost of healthcare here. Some of it feels to me like it's always been that way, so we're just going to keep charging. Just like when you were working in that ER, how much can I get? Some of the orthopedic doctors, how much can I get?
Right. I know this from looking at it this year. It wasn't always this way.
Is that right?
We've always been slightly higher, but we haven't been astronomically higher. That's really happened in the last couple of decades.
Oh, yeah, totally.
If you go back to the late 90s, the cost of healthcare in Alaska was slightly higher, but it was moving at the same rate as the rest of the country. And then we really did take a dramatic upsurge in cost compared to the costs elsewhere.
Do you think it's because, for example, you take a specialist here in town, there's one specialty group. What's to stop them from charging a lot? And the more they charge and the more they get, the more they charge. Why not? Why wouldn't you?
Right.
Lack of competition would be a big one.
This goes back to your dad's model. If the patients were coming in and you knew them and you knew they didn't have a lot of money, but you're the only gastroenterologist in town, I mean, are you really going to say that person's going to pay an insanely high amount for their colonoscopy? Do you know what I mean? It's just you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't, because there's this middleman there. I think people
Right.
feel like with insurance that
Right.
the person's not paying. We're
Right.
charging the insurance.
We're
company.
charging the insurance. That's right. And also, that model no longer exists. The doctor, where it's someone coming to you and you're deciding what to charge them or not to charge them. I mean, we had that a little bit early on in our careers when we would work, in the clinic, and we had cash paying patients and things like that. And we had a sliding scale. But you're right. I mean, it's removed. I'm billing the insurance company, but you and I both know that patient's going to get a bill.
Right.
And probably a pretty high bill. Right. And then sometimes there's been the practice here where the doctor isn't in their network and the patient doesn't know. And then the patient gets stuck with the whole bill. But there's a disconnect between the doctor and the patient financially.
So what can we do to make healthcare in Alaska less expensive?
Wow. If I knew, I don't know.
I know that you're a big reader. Do you have a book that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Oh my gosh. Oh, so many. Hello, Beautiful. I love that one.
What's Hello Beautiful?
It's about a family, and I can't, Napolitano or something like that is the author. I think I have to pull up my big reads because there's been so many good books. Okay. Molly the Maid, a really fun new mystery series about an autistic girl who's a maid in a fancy hotel and witnesses a murder. And then there's a second one. I just read Deacon King Kong by James McBride. Did you read that one?
No, but you liked it.
Yes, I did very much. I read it because I'd read The Heaven and Earth grocery store. I also really liked that. I love Emily Henry. I like The People We Meet on Vacation. These are all different kind of books. I went way back and read Rebecca by...
Oh, I love Daphne du Maurier.
Yeah.
So good. It's a
So
really
oldie.
good book.
It's a really good... Oh, The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese.
Oh, Verghese?
Verghese.
Yeah.
So good.
Because he's a doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He is a surgeon? For an
Oh, he's
ID?
HIV. He was HIV.
ID.
Yeah, ID.
He's ID. Yeah. And then The Vaster Wilds was really good. Lauren Groff's.
You've given a lot of good recommendations. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Dr. Benjamin.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.